Tonight, we open the doors to royal chambers where power and desire often blurred into something far more dangerous. In these quiet moments of history, kings and rulers crossed lines that reshaped their kingdoms, and sometimes their own fates. Before we begin, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy drifting off to stories like this. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from across time zones. Now, lower the lights, let the room grow still, and let's step gently into the hidden world of history's most provocative monarchs. What happens when an emperor controls everything, except his own obsessions? We'll take this slowly. A quiet look at how private impulses crossed into public rule, and how those choices echoed through courts and kingdoms. Many of these accounts come from hostile or sensational sources, so we'll treat them as stories that shaped reputations and politics, whether every detail was true or not. And it all begins with a monarch for whom mourning became something far more unsettling. Picture a dim stone chamber, its air heavy with candle wax and murmured prayers, and a queen watching you with eyes that haven't closed in days. It is night. She quietly insists there's been a mistake, that her husband does not belong in the ground. Many could recognize grief, but here, grief seemed to take on a will of its own. Joanna of Castile was not just any queen. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, Spain's powerful Catholic monarchs, and her marriage was meant to bind their dynasty to the House of Burgundy. Philip the Handsome, her husband, lived up to his epithet in nearly every courtly description that survives. For Joanna, the match was not only political, she loved him deeply. Perhaps too deeply in the eyes of some chroniclers, who, even before his death, called her emotions excessive. Whether their assessments were fair or sharpened by later politics is still argued by historians today. In 1506, Philip died suddenly in his 20s. The official cause was typhoid fever, though at the time, sudden death in the young and powerful prompted the usual swirl of speculation: poison, divine retribution, or quiet assassination. Whatever the truth, Joanna was not ready to accept that he was gone. At first, she delayed a formal burial, as though postponing an inevitable announcement. Under pressure, she agreed to place him in a royal tomb. In many courts, the story would stop there, but contemporary accounts say hers did not. According to multiple reports from the period, 3 months later, she ordered the coffin exhumed. Witnesses claimed it was opened, and Philip was revealed in his burial robes, embalmed in the materials available to the time. What might have been a final farewell became the beginning of something stranger. Rather than return him to rest, Joanna had the coffin placed under guard and arranged to travel with it through the countryside. Chroniclers wrote of a slow procession from town to town, not towards a grave, but as if she meant to keep him with her indefinitely. The image of a queen on the road with her husband's coffin stirred rumours everywhere it passed. Records suggest she avoided staying in lodgings where other women lived, allegedly saying she did not want him near anyone unfaithful. Some priests and courtiers worried not only for her health, but for the effect this constant public mourning had on the kingdom's image. At a time when royal decorum was tightly scripted, her journey became a spectacle, one that ambassadors dutifully reported home. This was more than a private tragedy. In an era when governance required visible authority, her absence from court for months meant postponed decisions, strained diplomacy, and growing unease among her advisors. Letters from her sister-in-law, Queen Blanche of Navarre, painted her as incapable of managing the realm. Observers knew Joanna came from a family with incidents of mental illness, a fact used by rivals as political shorthand for unfit to rule. The sight of her travelling with the coffin was all the evidence her father Ferdinand and later her son Charles would need to act. In 1509, Joanna was taken to the convent of Santa Clara at Tordesillas. On paper, it was for her comfort and safety. In reality, she lived under guard for the rest of her life. Philip was buried to stay, and Joanna, though still a queen in title, would never again lead her people. Visitors described her speaking of Philip as if he might still return. Whether this showed lasting delusion or a refusal to bow to protocol remains an open question for historians. Contemporary and later accounts disagree on how to interpret those years. Some amplify the more morbid details, while others suggest her behaviour was exaggerated by those eager to keep her sidelined. What is certain is that her long custody served the interests of those around her. It allowed her father to resume authority in Castile, and her son to inherit without contest. In politics, as in legend, the label mad can be as decisive as any royal decree. Her confinement lasted nearly half a century. In that time, she saw her children only on occasion and never walked free of the convent's walls. For the public, she was more ghost than monarch, a living reminder of an unsettling chapter in their history. The episode with Philip's coffin defined her reputation far more than any policy or alliance, fixed in place by the same storytellers who debated her sanity. It's worth noting how fragile the line was between personal sorrow and political liability. For male rulers, private eccentricities could be accommodated, even indulged, as long as the machinery of the state stayed in motion. For Joanna, her visible, prolonged grief and the symbolism of a queen travelling with her husband's body was treated as proof of incapacity. Whether one sees her as a woman undone by loss or as someone resisting the ceremonial erasure of her love, her fate was the same. When she died in 1555, Joanna had been out of public life for more than 40 years. Yet the stories survived, copied into chronicles and passed into legend. That journey with Philip's coffin, its nights on the road, the guarded stops, the refusal to let him go, remained the enduring image. In the end, it was that private act, filtered through the judgment of her contemporaries, that wrote her place in history. Centuries later, her story still invites debate. Was it madness, manipulation, or simply a grief the court refused to tolerate? The answer may never be certain, but either way, it shows how the most personal impulses can ripple outward until they reshape politics itself. And those ripples weren't unique to Castile. Elsewhere, in the guarded tranquility of another court, scandal and cruelty would come not from mourning, but from the living, exercising power in the most brutal ways imaginable. In the guarded quiet of Han China's imperial palace, life could look perfectly composed from the outside. Courtyards filled with the scent of tea, calligraphy scrolls hanging in orderly halls, attendants moving silently between lotus ponds. Emperor Jing of Han was known for steadying the empire after earlier turmoil, lowering taxes, reducing punishments, and holding rebellions in check. In public, his court projected harmony. But behind the lacquered doors of his family's private quarters, some of his sons were remembered in ancient chronicles for acts that suggested the calm was only a surface. Being born an imperial prince meant never hearing the word no. While most people in the empire laboured over crops or fought for survival, these young men dined on delicacies, wore silk lined with fur, handled weapons decorated in gold, and were attended by servants whose lives were theirs to command. Officially, this upbringing was meant to train them as future governors or military leaders. In practice, it raised men inside a closed circle of privilege, where humiliation of others carried no cost, and pleasure could be taken without consent or consequence. One of Emperor Jing's sons, Prince Tuan, is described in surviving records not for leadership or military skill, but for killing his own young male companion in a fit of anger. The boy had no political standing, no threat to the prince, merely someone who displeased him. According to court accounts, there was no investigation, no public charge. The incident was managed quietly. In a world where guards followed the commands of the royal family above law, written records might list nothing more than sudden illness as a cause of death. Prince Chu appears in the chronicles as a figure whose cruelty turned into performance. Contemporary texts claim he used heated needles on palace women who displeased him. The women, confined to the inner court, had nowhere to escape, and no one willing to challenge the emperor's son. In the official version, such acts could be excused as discipline, but behind walls they were something closer to ritualized torment. And then there was Prince Qian, whose name still stands out in Han family history. Ancient sources accuse him not only of sleeping with close kin, but also of making public entertainment out of the humiliation of women in his household, where shaming them was not enough. Some accounts say he had them drowned in the palace's ornamental lake. This same lake would host festivals and floating lanterns on one side, its other end functioning as a discreet grave. Reports like these, whether backed by eyewitnesses or coloured by moralising historians, shared a problem for the dynasty. They posed a danger to the image of the imperial house as the moral centre of the realm. In Han political thought, the emperor was the son of heaven and his family reflected cosmic order. Scandal among the princes suggested disorder at the heart of the state and risked the mandate of heaven, the divine approval believed to legitimize rule. For that reason, the court rarely made such matters public. Instead, incidents were contained. Servants and victims' relatives could be silenced through payment or reassignment. A disgraced prince might be sent away, nominally to govern a distant province, though in reality it could be a form of gilded exile. By moving the problem out of the capital, the dynasty reframed misconduct as administrative duty. What mattered most was to keep the imperial lineage untarnished in the eyes of the empire. The cruelty described in these records did not happen in isolation. It was part of a system where privilege was absolute, where the absence of oversight allowed behaviours to harden into habits. In that environment, hunts could be turned into stage chases involving people. Banquets could shift from music to degradation, and the suffering of others became a diversion rather than a scandal. No law or advisor would step in to stop it, not because all approved, but because speaking out risked more than silence ever would. This was not unique to Han China. History in other empires, Rome, medieval courts in Europe and beyond, contains similar patterns. Concentrating power in a family, removing outside checks and raising heirs with an ingrained sense of entitlement often produced the same result. People in protected positions treating harm as entertainment, while the institutions around them work to protect the family name rather than the victims. For Emperor Jing, the challenge was to preserve the stability he had built while masking the damage inside his household. Confucian ideals tied a ruler's virtue to the health of the state. If the emperor's own sons were publicly seen as corrupt or cruel, the legitimacy of his authority could suffer. The solution was to emphasize his own fairness, surround him with symbols of order, and quietly separate his image from his sons' reputations. Official histories written during his lifetime avoided detailing the darker episodes, and it was only later, under different political climates, that fuller accounts appeared. Within the palace walls, however, nothing was truly forgotten. Eunuchs, attendants, and minor functionaries knew who posed dangers, and to whom. They learned to navigate the palace carefully, aware of which rooms and courtyards to avoid, and when. For them, survival meant accommodating the moods of princes who were shielded from consequence. It was an unspoken truth that the dynasty's order coexisted with its private chaos. The cost of such hidden cruelty was not only in lives lost or warped, It was in the gradual erosion of trust among those who served the dynasty. When loyalty came to rest solely on self-interest and fear, rather than respect, cracks formed in the political structure. The Han court managed to control the spread of stories beyond its walls for the most part, but those within the elite knew, and that knowledge shaped their behaviour toward the ruling family. No public trial was ever recorded for Prince Tuan, Prince Chu, or Prince Qian. Whatever consequences they faced happened behind closed doors, and never entered the official annals while the dynasty stood. But the idea that heaven watched the ruler's family as closely as it watched the ruler himself gave weight to rumours. In later generations, chroniclers would use these tales to comment on the dynasty's moral fitness. What remains clear is that imperial courts, whatever their location or time period, have often been built to control the flow of information as much as to govern a realm. By managing scandal privately, they could maintain the outer image of virtue. Yet the risk was always that, once such stories began circulating, they could grow into enduring marks on a dynasty's reputation. That tension between political achievement and personal scandal was not limited to the East. In another place, in another time, a ruler celebrated as one of Europe's great unifiers would see his public legacy shadowed by accusations that, true or not, outlived the empire he built. Charlemagne's name still stands high in the record books, a ruler tied to sweeping reforms, conquests, and the shaping of medieval Europe. Laws, schools, infrastructure. He left more than enough to fill the great man chapters of history. But alongside those celebrated achievements, later medieval writers recorded another layer of stories, rumours with no clear contemporary proof, yet potent enough to cling to his reputation long after his death. These weren't playful court jokes, they were the kind of charges that could corrode the image of a Christian emperor. If they stuck, what you learn in school tends to stop at the official version. Crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in 800, pulling fractured kingdoms into a single political body, promoting Christianity and literacy, tightening up law codes. But medieval people didn't just hear about their leaders from official court reports. They shared and repeated the stories that moved from one mouth to the next. And in those less formal accounts, Charlemagne sometimes appeared in scenes sharply at odds with his image as defender of the faith. One accusation painted him in one of the darkest lights possible for the moral codes of his time, a supposed incestuous relationship with his sister, named in some accounts as Gillen. In a Christian society, this wasn't simply a private sin, it was an offence believed to invite God's curse on a dynasty. To put that stain on an emperor's name suggested not just personal weakness, but the withdrawal of divine favour, a dangerous implication in an age where rulers legitimated their power as God's chosen. Another tale went further still. Some later medieval sources accused him of an unnatural fascination with the dead, claims that he maintained an intimate connection with a body after death. The term necrophilia didn't exist in his time, but the act was understood well enough to be called abhorrent, a breach of moral and divine law. In a society where holy relics could be venerated, crossing that boundary into sexual contact with the dead was imagined as the ultimate perversion of sacred order. Why would anyone circulate such extreme stories? They were weapons. In a Christian political culture, alleging incest or illicit contact with a corpse suggested the ruler stood outside divine grace. That made the charge almost irresistible to enemies. You couldn't always topple such a man on the battlefield, but you might erode the loyalty he depended on by framing him as cursed or morally repellent. Medieval rumour was not passed in the way modern news spreads. It relied on human memory and repetition. A cleric might copy an anecdote decades after the fact, adding his own interpretation. A travelling merchant could carry a fragment of gossip from one court to another. Inevitably, the details shifted. These particular rumours seem to appear most clearly in later medieval chronicle traditions, written well after Charlemagne's lifetime. That distance matters. It leaves us unsure whether the stories began as small-scale political slander in his reign, or took shape only after he was gone, when chroniclers could be freer in criticising him. Some variants even claimed Charlemagne sought a kind of otherworldly absolution. They describe him visiting saints' shrines, not for community worship, but to ask forgiveness for sins no living priest dared to hear. Whether this scene was meant as penitence or as a way to underline his guilt, it stuck in the imagination, the emperor alone in dim candlelight before a stone tomb, speaking to relics rather than the living. No solid evidence connects him to such rites. But once written down, the image was difficult to erase. From a historian's perspective, there's nothing like firm proof for either charge. Genealogical records don't consistently identify Gillen as his sister, and there's no eyewitness account worth trusting on the necrophilia claim. These tales most likely served a political purpose, to give rivals, maybe even members of his extended family or discontented bishops, an easy way to tarnish his sanctified public persona. The wider the empire, the more internal enemies it held. And for those enemies, morality could be the easiest battlefield to fight him on. They lingered, because they touched on themes medieval audiences understood instinctively. Incest implied decay in a ruling line. Forbidden contact with the dead suggested the breakdown of the boundary between sacred and profane. Even listeners unsure of the facts could feel the weight of the accusation. And because the allegations struck at moral fitness to rule, they didn't need to be proven in court to do harm. They operated in the realm of belief. The culture made this especially potent. In the medieval mind, the ruler's personal virtue directly linked to the health of the realm. Fail there, and the kingdom might suffer famine, disaster, or military defeat, all interpreted as God's judgment. That's why rumours about Charlemagne's supposed private violations, however unfounded, had the power to work beneath the surface, feeding doubts about whether he truly ruled with divine sanction. It's possible he was simply the subject of well-crafted slander. It's possible there were kernels of truth twisted beyond recognition. We can't know. But the very survival of these stories, centuries after they might first have been uttered, points to how powerfully they resonated. They persist in marginal notes in chronicles, in oral traditions that later got written down, not because they outweigh his achievements, but because they offer a sharp contradiction to them. The mind remembers contrasts more readily than consistency. Rumour in this form is more than entertainment. It's a tool that can shape how history remembers someone as effectively as any monument or text of law. Once seeded, it can live on without corroboration, becoming part of the background against which all later stories about that person are told. In Charlemagne's case, formal histories built the image of the ideal emperor, while the shadow stories provided a counter-image for those willing to look for it. That is the lesson here. Political reputation rests not only on deeds done in life, but on the stories, true or false, that survive. Those who understood that could bend memory itself into a weapon, ensuring that long after a ruler's death his image could be chipped away or reshaped to fit another's purpose. Truth was just one ingredient. Belief was the one that mattered. And sometimes, even an unverified rumour about desire and death could exert more pull over the imagination than any confirmed act of war or statecraft. In Charlemagne's case, the accusations stayed whispers, entries in chronicles few outside the learned world would hear during his life. But there were other rulers whose attachments to the dead were not left to speculation, cases where that obsession became visible, undeniable, and, to their courts, profoundly disturbing. What if a king's passion for his queen didn't end with her life, or even with the order for her execution? Herod the Great, the ruler of Judea under Roman oversight, is best remembered from religious and political history as a master builder, a survivor of shifting alliances, and a man whose reign could be as brutal as it was ambitious. But there's another account, one that moves away from fortresses and aqueducts, and into a chamber few were meant to see. It's a story of marriage, jealousy, and, according to sources that may have been as eager to warn as to record, an act of possession that refused to let the living or the dead have peace. Mariamne, the woman at the heart of this, was no ordinary royal consort. She was Hasmonean, descended from the dynasty that had ruled Jerusalem before Rome absorbed Judea, and her marriage to Herod brought him more than beauty. It linked him to a line that still carried deep prestige and legitimacy among his subjects. Contemporary accounts suggest she was clever, politically astute, and unafraid to speak her mind. Those qualities could endear her to Herod one day, and ignite his suspicion the next. To a ruler whose power was always shadowed by doubt and rivalry, that mix of connection and independence was intoxicating and dangerous. Herod's suspicion was part of his rule. He had already eliminated rivals in sudden purges. Brothers-in-law, uncles, even his own sons could be swept away if he started to doubt their loyalty. The more intimate the relationship, the quicker suspicion could turn lethal. In Mariamne's case, whatever kernel of truth lay behind the accusations against her was wrapped in rumour and court intrigue. What's certain is that when jealousy took hold, Herod ordered her execution. The official record states that she died accused of betrayal. That, by itself, was common enough in ancient courts. But here is where the account veers into unsettling territory. According to the Talmud and later writers who repeated its details, sources deeply hostile to Herod and often moralizing, her death did not end his bond to her. Instead, they claim, he had her body preserved, perhaps with oils and spices, and kept it close. Not for days or weeks, but, in their telling, for 7 years. Whatever the literal truth, the notion of a king extending his claim over his wife's body far beyond death would have stood out as a breach of accepted mourning. Judean custom gave grief its place. Garments torn, public lamentation for fixed days, prayers and gatherings marking the transition from life to memory. To hold on to the body was to refuse that transition entirely, turning grief into ownership. If the story is accurate, it was a private breaking of a very public boundary. In trying to interpret the motive, the same sources offer multiple paths. There's the personal, guilt tangled with obsession, the same emotions that had once tightened into suspicion and rage. There's also the political. Even in death, Mariamne's Hasmonean lineage was valuable to Herod's image. Keeping her present in the palace, even hidden from public view, could feel like keeping his link to centuries of royal blood. And then, whispered by his enemies, there was the allegation that his grief had crossed into possession of the body in a way meant to be understood as deeply unnatural. Historians are divided. Some point out that these accounts emerge from traditions that used Herod as a cautionary example of unchecked jealousy and moral corruption, making their trustworthiness suspect. Others note that while 7 years might be exaggerated, it fits a broader pattern in Herod's life, eliminating those closest to him when suspicion struck, then withdrawing in remorse that could spiral into obsession. Within that pattern, the method, preservation, confinement, control, would echo the jealousies that shaped his relationships in life. True or not, the telling stuck. Herod already carried a reputation for cruelty. This story added a layer of morbid fascination. It painted him as a man who could not bear to lose what he believed was his, even when that loss came by his own command. In the ancient world, reputation was shaped as much by the stories people whispered as by the monuments they could touch. A ruler's deeds in private, or the deeds believed to have been done in private, could become part of the public record if they resonated strongly enough. If the chamber existed, you can imagine its reality. guarded, inaccessible, tended by only the most loyal servants. Not a tomb for mourners, but a room where time stopped. Those within the palace would learn to pass by without asking questions. Those outside could only trade speculation. And in that space, Herod might have convinced himself that he had halted decay, halted departure, turning death into something under his command. For the stories tell us the lesson was about the corruption of love when combined with absolute power. Public mourning gives the community a way to move forward. Here, grief was stripped of its public face and made permanent, a private act sustained by authority no one dared challenge. In recasting Mariamne's fate, the chroniclers turned her from a victim of court politics into a symbol of what happens when grief and domination become the same thing. The way the story has survived also says something about how a single vivid image can outweigh a lifetime of other acts. Herod built cities, restructured economies, negotiated with Rome in ways that kept Judea semi-autonomous. Yet the picture that lingers in many retellings is of a preserved queen in a locked room. The alleged 7-year corpse crowded out the details of treaties and infrastructure because it aligned so neatly with the traits his enemies told people to expect. It is a portrait as much about the man's weaknesses, jealousy, insecurity, the hunger to control others, as it is about any one deed. Whether the body remained in that room for years or the account was a polemical exaggeration, the persistence of the tale speaks to its plausibility within what people believed about Herod's nature. If he could kill a wife over suspicion, they reasoned, maybe he could keep her as a trophy of both love and power after death. And that's the deeper thread here. Stories of rulers holding too tightly, of reshaping love into possession, have always carried an added sting. They make listeners ask themselves how far such control might reach and whether it could as easily be applied to the living as to the dead. In Herod's case, the accusation was aimed at painting him as a monarch who saw everything and everyone as subject to his will at all times. When you track these kinds of accounts across history, you find that the particular form of possession varies, but the principle rarely does. Sometimes it's about keeping what's gone. Other times it's about controlling what's still alive but removed from any outside reach. The setting shifts, the justifications change, but the intent, to hold and to rule without interruption, remains the same. In the reign that followed, the fixation wasn't on guarding a preserved body. It shifted out of the realm of death and into a very calculated arrangement for the living, one designed to remove the ruler from the demands of politics and place him in a fortress built solely for pleasure, far from those marble halls and watching eyes. Some rulers chose to tighten their grip on the capital. Others, like Rome's Tiberius, chose distance. Rather than stand in the Senate or parade through the Forum, he crossed the water to a rocky island whose steep cliffs all but dared anyone to follow. Capri. To outsiders, it could be framed as a retreat for an old ruler in need of quiet. To those inside his circle, it became something else entirely, a place where the demands of state could not intrude, and the only priorities were the emperor's own. By the time Tiberius made Capri his main residence, he was in his 70s. He'd spent decades holding the empire's borders steady, commanding armies, and managing the aftermath of Augustus's reign. Public life had worn him down. Capri offered a setting where access was entirely on his terms. In Rome, servants, informants, and the thin walls of the Palatine made secrecy impossible. On this island, nothing and no one reached him without his permission. Geography gave him the sort of control no bodyguard could enforce. Sheer cliffs dropped into deep blue water, and only a handful of small beaches or rocky inlets allowed landing. Villas were perched where he could watch the approaches. It meant that whatever Tiberius chose to do there, whether quiet dinners or spectacles whispered about in every market, remained for the eyes he selected. It was a controlled world, cut off from the noise of the capital, and in that space, his private taste could become the centre of court life. What happened behind those walls is known to us mainly through later historians like Suetonius and Tacitus. They were not shy about reporting scandal, especially if it cast the emperor as corrupt. Many of the most lurid anecdotes of carefully trained pages of games meant to titillate rather than entertain come from those hostile accounts. Historians today are cautious. Some details may be true, others exaggerated or invented. But in Rome, the truth often mattered less than what was repeated. The Capri stories were repeated often. In Suetonius' telling, the island operated like a private theatre. Participants were selected for beauty, novelty, or skill, then arranged into orchestrated displays meant to please a single audience, the emperor himself. If the accounts are correct, these gatherings were less about casual indulgence than about control. Guests and performers were reminded in a way impossible to miss that the same man who commanded the legions also commanded their bodies, movements, and compliance. Personal dominance doubled as a message about political dominance. Consent in this setting was a fragile concept. When an emperor extended an invitation, refusal could be dangerous. For some, the summons meant gifts, advancement, protection. For others, it meant being removed from their old lives altogether. The lines between favoured guest, servant, and captive blurred until they were mostly imaginary. Romans were no strangers to sex as part of public life. Brothels existed openly. Erotic art decorated homes and taverns, and powerful men took lovers without scandal. But the Capri arrangement, as described by its sources, went further. It was systematized, not just indulgence, but a hierarchy of roles and assignments that reflected the emperor's will. In that sense, it mirrored the structure of imperial administration with the same expectation of obedience. Back in the city, government carried on in his absence. Senators debated, governors were named, military honours awarded, all while the emperor stayed hundreds of miles away. For some, this was proof the system worked. Rome could function without daily interference from the top. For others, his absence signalled growing weakness, and Capri became a shorthand for neglect. Despite its isolation, the island's reputation could not be contained. Supply ships came and went, and with them snippets of rumour from sailors, craftsmen, and lower-ranking staff. Accounts of staged banquets where performance mattered more than food, of gardens designed for spectatorship rather than flowers, slipped into conversation in the capital. Even toned down, such stories made the emperor seem remote and self-indulgent. Here the distinction between reality and perception blurred. The more the gossip spread, the more it damaged what little popular affection Tiberius had enjoyed. He'd never matched Augustus in charm, and Capri only deepened the image of a ruler withdrawn from the people he governed. Whether every claim was accurate no longer mattered. In politics, image was reality. Later chroniclers shaped that image with their own agendas. Suetonius painted the island as a catalogue of vice, stitched together from court gossip and moralizing cautionary tales. His framing was clear. Excess, secrecy, and isolation eroded imperial virtue. Even if he exaggerated, certain details appear in multiple sources, suggesting some baseline of credible report. What set Capri apart from other imperial indulgences was its secrecy. Caligula would flaunt himself in Rome, Tiberius hid on his cliffs. But hidden or not, the stories found a way to surface. To senators, Capri symbolized abandonment of public duty. To ordinary Romans, it marked the gulf between their lives and those of the ruling elite. And to his rivals, it was ready-made propaganda. Here was proof, convenient whether true or not, that the emperor had retreated into private pleasures while the empire governed itself. As the years passed, Tiberius rarely set foot on the mainland. Communications and decrees came by messenger. When matters of state intruded, they were handled briefly and at a distance. The villas on Capri kept their routines, and the island's carefully managed world continued at the pace of one man's interests. Those brought into its inner circles sometimes rose in influence, using the emperor's favour as currency. Others disappeared from record entirely, the simplest signal that they'd fallen out of grace in a place that answered to no court but his. Capri's significance lies in more than its gossip value. It shows how personal authority and political authority could merge completely in one man. The island was governed like his empire, selectively open, carefully stratified, and centered on the incontestable power of the ruler. Each private act reinforced that larger structure. Over time, the name Capri became another way to describe an emperor's withdrawal from public responsibility. When Tiberius died, his island life became part of his legacy, half remembered as a strategic retreat, half as a moral failure. Even without certainty over every detail, the image of an aging ruler surrounded by amusements, away from Rome's streets and forums, outlasted the man himself. It was proof that a ruler could run an empire from afar, and also a warning about what happened when that distance was spent on narrowing pleasures. Rome's next ruler wouldn't hide from view. He would take the idea of mixing authority and intimacy and place it in the full glare of public ceremony, using the institutions of state as a kind of stage. In time, that stage would host one of the empire's strangest and most talked about weddings, the kind that left no one in doubt about who was directing the performance. What if the grandest wedding in imperial Rome didn't involve a bride in the way anyone expected? The bride was a teenage boy. The groom was Emperor Nero, by this point already unrestrained, having removed the one person who had ever seriously tried to check his impulses: his mother. Ancient writers report that this period marked the most unpredictable and theatrical years of his rule, years in which personal desire and political image blended into the same performance. Sporus enters the record here. He was young, how young no source can agree on, and noted, even by hostile accounts, for a striking resemblance to Nero's late wife, Poppaea Sabina. That resemblance caught the emperor's attention, turning idle observation into a plan. Ancient writers report that Nero ordered Sporus to be castrated. For a Roman male, this was not a common household punishment. It was irreversible, rare, and publicly identifying. In the emperor's hands, it was not just an act on a body, but a declaration that Sporus would now fit the role Nero imagined for him. From there, Nero began presenting Sporus not as a companion nor as a male courtier, but as the living stand-in for Poppaea. The clothing shifted, replacing male tunics with the stola and veil of a high-born Roman woman. And Nero didn't leave it in the realm of private indulgence. Ancient writers, most of them hostile to him, describe a formal public wedding, full ceremony, invited guests, and all the trappings expected when two noble Roman families were joined. Imagine the setup, a richly decorated venue as if for a diplomatic alliance, except the two families were the emperor himself and a boy with no birth family present. This union was not about forming a political bloc, it was a calculated display. Sporus, veiled, was led through the rituals every Roman recognized as announcing a marriage. Nero provided a dowry, a formal obligation in elite weddings, but here drawn entirely from the imperial treasury. Every stage of the ritual was enacted under the eyes of Rome's most powerful figures. Invitations from the emperor were commands. Attendance was not optional. Senators, military officers, and wealthy patrons watched the event. They could applaud, offer formal toasts, and outwardly follow the pattern of a marriage celebration, but each knew the underlying message. Their customs could be altered at a whim. By naming Sporus Poppaea, Nero made the replacement explicit. The public appearances, the processions, the ceremonial order, all reinforced the fiction as official fact. In Rome's elite culture, sexual variety in private life did not shock. What mattered deeply was keeping public rituals consistent, because those rituals underpinned political order. Marriages were not personal fantasies on display. They were transactions linking houses, affirming status, and signaling stability in rule. Ancient accounts of this wedding stress not its romance, but its subversion. Nero used one of Rome's most conservative institutions as a stage prop. The act forced Rome's elite to accept and participate in a redefinition of marriage that blurred gender categories and removed the union's political function. Viewed politically, the act was as much test as indulgence. If the Senate and leading families could watch such a ritual stripped of its traditional grounding and still treat it as legitimate, it meant their loyalty, or fear, outweighed their allegiance to ancestral custom. It became a measurement of submission. An emperor could suspend the meaning of law and ritual, and the structure of power would hold. Source bias matters here. Much of what we know of Nero comes from authors writing after his fall, many with strong incentives to cast him as decadent and dangerous. Suetonius, Dio Cassius, and others select episodes that highlight eccentricity or moral collapse, and this wedding fits that mold. Yet even if their tone is hostile, the consistency of the core details, the castration, the marriage ceremony, the public role for Sporus, suggests the event took place, and that its symbolic weight was understood in his time. The difference between this and Nero's occasional cross-dressing at feasts is that the Sporus marriage was not intended as a single-night novelty. It was established as an ongoing visible relationship given the legal and ceremonial markers of marriage. Within the hierarchy of the court, spoke on son tuor. Rus was treated not as a performer but as the emperor's consort. Public ritual had been bent around a private arrangement, and once altered, it stayed that way. Reactions in the wider population are harder to gauge. To ordinary Romans, it may have blended into the list of imperial spectacles, extravagant games, stage performances, public feasts. To the senatorial class and senior military officers, it was a calculated disruption of the symbols they relied on to frame imperial authority. An emperor who treated political ritual as his personal theatre could, in their eyes, destabilize the very image of rule that made their positions meaningful. There was no recorded attempt to halt it while Nero lived. Sporus remained in the imperial household, accompanying Nero on travels, appearing in public functions, and continuing to be called by Poppeia's name. The marriage became a kind of fixed reference point in gossip and elite memory. For chroniclers, it served as an example of the emperor's disregard for tradition. For contemporaries, it was a reminder of the risks of showing dissent in the face of the emperor's self-presentation. Stripped of exaggeration, the event still marks one of the rare occasions when personal desire directly rewrote public ritual in ancient Rome. The emperor had taken the most solemn form of social agreement among the elite and adapted it entirely to suit himself. Whether that choice came from personal grief, theatrical impulse, or a desire to test the limits of deference, it expressed in ceremony what military power expressed on campaign. His will overrode all other structures. For Sporus, the role was imposed, not chosen. Whatever safety or influence came with being treated as empress, it was contingent on remaining in favour. That dependence underlined the imbalance at the core of the arrangement. This was not a union of two parties, but one person's public command over another's identity. It's one of the reasons the story endures long after the details of other marriages and alliances have been forgotten. The image is simple: veil, dowry, ceremonial procession, but the context gives it weight. In it, you see the merger of private possession and public governance, the transformation of intimacy into a political event no one could ignore. And while the forms of such power games change, the dynamic repeats itself throughout history. Rulers have long used the language of family, love, and loyalty to stage acts meant not for the heart, but for the hierarchy. Sometimes the target was a spouse, sometimes an enemy, sometimes their own kin. In each case, the form, wedding, exile, adoption, execution, carried meaning beyond the individual, signalling the reach of authority into the most personal spaces. In Nero's Rome, the message was delivered through a marriage. In another court, in another century, a ruler would send a similar message through the life and death of someone far closer, his own child. That decision, and the way it was carried out, showed that the performance of power did not always require an audience in the Senate or in the streets. It could take place in silence, behind closed gates, with consequences felt for generations. Imagine being a king and deciding that your own heir could not be allowed to live, not because of illness or injury, but because you believed his survival posed a greater danger to your dynasty, your grip on power, and the stability of the realm itself. In 18th century Korea, that was the choice King Yongjo made about his son, Crown Prince Sado. And instead of an open execution, which Confucian law and tradition treated as unthinkable for a royal heir, he chose a method that could be carried out within palace grounds without the public bloodshed that would shame the throne. Yongjo's reign was long and in many ways effective. He pursued reforms, maintained order, and navigated the tangled web of aristocratic factions that could bring a king down. But when it came to his only surviving son, the relationship was deeply strained. In a royal household, every gesture could be read as obedience or defiance. From early on, Sado seemed to resist his father's authority, and the tension only deepened as he approached adulthood. Accounts from the court describe an heir whose behavior was erratic at best and violent at worst. He refused audiences with ministers, left formal gatherings abruptly, and neglected important rites. The reports grow darker: assaults on attendants, beatings of servants, and, in some cases, killings inside the palace. As crown prince, he wielded unchecked authority over those in his household. For the victims, refusal was not an option. Discipline was immediate and often brutal. The reasons remain debated. Some historians point to mental illness. Others see resentment toward an exacting father who demanded perfection in all things. Whatever the cause, Sado's capacity to serve as the kingdom's future ruler came into serious question. In the Confucian moral framework that guided the Joseon dynasty, the ruler was expected to be a model of virtue and self-control. A prince unable to master his own impulses was more than a personal disgrace. He was a political liability. Alcohol made matters worse. Drinking in court life was ceremonial, governed by strict etiquette. Daily drunkenness in the royal family was a grave breach of discipline. Sado's drinking, especially when it intensified his erratic behavior, reinforced fears about his fitness to rule. In Joseon Korea, a man's ability to govern himself was inseparable from his right to govern others. By the time Yongjo moved from frustration to decisive action, the issue had grown beyond family discord. Ministers feared the chaos that might follow Sado's accession. The queen, Sado's mother, faced the impossible task of protecting her son while acknowledging the threat he posed. Some at court saw only two likely futures: a coup after the king's death, or the erosion of royal authority under Sado's rule. A conventional execution was impossible. Shedding royal blood in public would violate the principle that the royal body was sacred, even in disgrace. A formal trial would air damaging details and expose weakness to political rivals. Exile risked giving Sado the freedom to plot his return. Yongjo chose a method that avoided formal execution but ensured a permanent end. The order was simple. A large wooden rice chest, the kind used to store grain, was brought into the palace yard. Sado was commanded to step inside. The lid was closed and fastened. No air holes, no way out. Confinement in the chest allowed the king to remove his son without ceremonial desecration. There would be no executioner to name, no public spectacle to record. But everyone within the palace understood exactly what it meant. The chest remained sealed for 8 days. The choice of method lent the act a veneer of necessity rather than cruelty. But for those inside the palace, the knowledge of what was happening was chilling. Servants and officials went about their duties in the shadow of it, aware that the heir to the throne lay confined inside. When the chest was finally opened, Sado was dead. His removal ended the immediate threat to dynastic stability, but it came at a profound cost. This was not a rebellious cousin or a treacherous general. It was the king's own son, raised to inherit the throne. By killing him, Yongjo forced a sudden shift in the line of succession and unsettled alliances across the court. In the Confucian ideals that shaped Joseon kingship, the bond between father and son was the model for the bond between ruler and subject. To sever that bond so completely was a statement in itself. Dynastic survival outweighed blood ties. It told every courtier that loyalty to the throne surpassed loyalty to family, even to the heir apparent. The political message was immediate. Within days, the court realigned around the king's decision. Those who had feared Sardo exhaled in relief. Those who had supported him had no safe way to object. Yongzhou had avoided creating a martyr who could inspire rebellion. The rice chest made the act final, closed, and beyond appeal. For later generations, the facts of Sardo's behavior and the fairness of Yongzhou's decision remained matters of debate. Some saw a troubled man failed by those who should have protected him. Others believed he was dangerous enough to justify any means of removal. But the manner of his death became the defining detail of his life, the reason he is remembered as the prince in the box. For those who lived through it, the lesson was clear. The king's authority had no limit. Kinship was no shield. If the ruler judged you a threat, the method of your removal would be whatever suited his purpose: silent confinement, public disgrace, or death. Courtiers learned that survival depended on aligning themselves precisely with the king's will, never assuming private bonds could temper his judgment. Sardo's death also set a precedent. By choosing a method outside the formal process, Yongzhou showed that even royal taboos could be bent when the throne's security was at stake. It reshaped life at court. Ministers and relatives alike understood that court etiquette was not mere formality, it was a survival strategy. And though this act took place within one royal household, its shadow reached far beyond. Visiting nobles, foreign envoys, and ambitious officials could see that palace walls enclosed both splendor and danger. A misstep in etiquette, a poorly timed alliance, or a gesture that displeased the king could end a career or a life without trial or accusation. In the memory of the palace, the rice chest came to symbolize more than Sardo's death. It stood for the quiet, absolute methods by which a ruler could secure his version of stability. Ministers might advise, the queen might plead, but once the chest was shut, the decision was beyond reversal. That image lingered long after Sardo's burial, woven into the unspoken rules of survival. Whether born into the bloodline or admitted as a guest, you measured every word, every glance, and every gesture against the knowledge that the king's favor could turn without warning. Not every sovereign chose to wield that power in secrecy. Some preferred to display their dominance in the most public ways possible, using court gatherings as a stage for control. And sometimes, as guests at one infamous emperor's banquet discovered, the performance played out right at the dining table. You take your place at a formal banquet, the kind where the guest list is made up of Rome's political class, senior officers, and anyone the emperor decides is important enough or vulnerable enough to be summoned. The space shimmers with oil lamps reflecting off marble and polished silver. At the head of the table sits Caligula. Your name on the invitation isn't a mark you can refuse. Showing up is as much about survival as it is about status. The meal begins in the usual way, wine poured at the right moments, musicians providing a soft background, servants circulating with platters of food. For a while, everything follows the script. Then, according to near-contemporary sources who wrote about his reign, most of them hostile senators or later historians like Suetonius, Caligula would shift the focus from the food to the people at the table, specifically to the wives of his male guests. These accounts describe him treating the dinner not only as a place to eat, but as a stage for testing loyalty and asserting dominance. When the emperor's attention fixed on someone, the tension in the room would change. A guest might watch his own spouse singled out with a glance, then see her quietly ushered away at Caligula's request. What happened next was left for the emperor to bring up or not on her return. Sometimes, say the sources, he would speak as if offering praise. Other times he would use the moment to undermine the husband in front of the entire gathering. Whether every one of these reported scenarios happened exactly as written is unknown. What's clear is that they left the impression of a ruler who could insert himself into any household's private sphere without consequence. It wasn't confined to guests' families. The same sources allege that he blurred boundaries inside his own. They claim he openly favoured his sisters in ways that unsettled even Rome's relatively permissive elite, at times behaving with them in public in ways that hinted at relationships far outside accepted norms. Given the political climate in which these histories were written, some of this could be exaggeration or moralizing aimed at discrediting his memory. But the recurrence of such themes across accounts suggests his conduct with kin and guests alike was designed to be seen and to have an effect. The political logic in this is easier to map than the personal one. By involving himself in someone else's marriage or family at a public function, Caligula made a point. Rank, law, and personal dignity all came second to his will. Roman aristocracy relied on shared understandings about what was and wasn't public. A senator's wife might be admired, courted discreetly, or used as an alliance link, but she wasn't meant to be a prop in a scene staged for her husband's discomfort. Crossing that line was less about private indulgence and more about public theatre, reminding an entire elite audience that no part of their lives was beyond his reach. Fear played a role here. In a court where no one knew whether a feast would pass without incident or turn into an exercise in humiliation, the safest posture was silence and compliance. Sources hostile to Caligula portray this climate as deliberate. By keeping everyone unsure of his next move, he kept them too preoccupied to mount opposition. Whatever the accuracy of individual incidents, the composite picture is of a ruler who used unpredictability and embarrassment the way others used military discipline. It's worth remembering that we hear these stories almost entirely from those positioned to dislike him. Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Tacitus all wrote from senatorial perspectives, sometimes decades after Caligula's death, when depicting him as the model of excess suited their political and moral arguments. Ancient historiography wasn't bound by modern standards of evidence. A memorable story illustrating a point could take on its own truth if it fitted the subject's reputation. That doesn't make the themes meaningless. On the contrary, whether each episode happened exactly as told matters less than the fact that people believed this was the way he ruled and feared being next. For those in attendance, these dinners likely felt like unstable performances. One evening might pass without incident. Another might see a leading general reduced to polite silence as his household became the topic of the emperor's amusement. There was no safe script to follow. The decorations, the refined courses, the cultured entertainments all masked the possibility that at any moment the attention in the room could be turned on you. By using family ties, emblems of stability in Rome, as pieces on his personal game board, Caligula ensured the court remained a place of constant readiness. To the wider Roman public, stories from these meals travelled fast. In a society without formal news outlets, the daily talk of markets, baths, and barracks served as both entertainment and a warning. A scandal from the evening before could become a citywide topic within days, reinforcing the image of a ruler unbound by his own laws. That image carried risk. The same public humiliations that kept courtiers cautious also built resentment. Each man embarrassed in front of his peers, each woman drawn unwillingly into a performance became another point of potential retaliation. Combine that with growing discontent over spending, suspected political purges, and signs of instability, and the stockpile of grievances grew. Accounts from his assassination note how many in the Senate and the Praetorian Guard already held personal reason to see him removed. In that light, the dinners were part of a broader erosion of his support. Still, from a purely tactical view, the method had its uses while it lasted. Turning the expected privacy of a marriage into an emperor's stage blurred the line between political loyalty and personal submission. When even home life could be interrupted in front of an audience, the message was that no status or tradition offered protection. Humiliation wasn't just a byproduct, it was an instrument, as precise in its way as a decree or an arrest. The recollection of these banquets in later sources lingers not because they catalogue every menu or lampstand, but because they depict a style of rule in which the boundaries between ruler and ruled, between public ritual and private life, were deliberately dissolved. In the hands of someone like Caligula, a shared table could become a reminder that nothing, not even the most intimate connections, lay outside his authority. His reign ended violently, brought down by many of the same elites who had once sat at those tables. Yet the stories about those evenings endured, not simply as gossip, but as symbols of how intimacy can be weaponized in politics. They echo the pattern we've seen in other courts, where normal limits are ignored and personal boundaries are put on display to prove that one person's power is absolute. And in Rome, the next example of that kind of display would come from a ruler willing to make himself the centerpiece, not by intruding on someone else's private life, but by redefining his own in view of everyone who entered his court. Imagine arriving at the imperial palace expecting the usual layers of ceremony, guards announcing your name, aides leading you through columns into some vast audience hall, and instead finding the emperor himself at the entrance. Except he's not in military regalia or the white-bordered toga of state. He's in a long dress, silks in vivid colours, makeup applied with care, and a jewelled headdress more like that of a priestess than a commander. No herald, no formalities, just the teenage ruler of Rome greeting you as if nothing about it were unusual. This was how Elagabalus was reported to receive visitors in the early 3rd century. Even in a city used to eccentric emperors, the sight was unsettling for many and fascinating for others. He had come to power very young, carrying with him not only the political influence of his family, but the religious traditions of his Syrian heritage, especially devotion to the sun god Elagabal. This wasn't just a private faith. He brought the god into Rome's formal religious calendar, elevated its rites above those of Jupiter, and shifted ceremonies to match the customs of his home culture. It was a religious realignment, and he tied it directly to himself as high priest. That meant the clothing and symbols of rule he chose weren't only about personal style, they were part of a public presentation designed to blend political leadership with ritual authority in ways Rome had not seen before. The changes to his image were immediate and deliberate. Instead of the armor, togas, and laurel crowns associated with imperial authority, Elagabalus dressed in garments linked to women and to the Eastern temple service he led. At formal events, he might appear in the embroidered vestments of a priestess. In palace receptions open to selected guests, he wore the stola and veil of a Roman matron. His hair could be dressed in styles copied from high-ranking women, his face painted in fashions recognized from the capital's elite households. Every movement seemed calculated to be noticed. In Roman culture, these were far more than costume choices. The cut of a garment, the fabric length, even the way it draped signaled a person's role and place in society. Men's tunics fell above the knee, women's gowns to the ankle. Certain headdresses were exclusive to the priesthoods, others to matrons. Changing them across gender lines in public challenged legal and social boundaries that were part of Rome's civic order. It was not only a matter of taste, it was a visible questioning of the visual language that signaled who held authority. Ancient sources, often written by senators and historians who disapproved of both his religion and his behavior, record that he coupled this presentation with openly favoring male lovers, appearing alongside them at meals and public functions. Rome had long accepted same-sex relationships, particularly between men of different social standing, but the unspoken rule for elite male citizens was to be seen as the senior, masculine partner. Taking on a role coded as receptive or overtly feminine, especially as emperor, reversed the usual power association and was read as loss of status. Those same sources, hostile and often moralizing, also claimed he blurred public and private roles in ways Romans found intolerable. Some alleged he offered himself in arrangements more commonly associated with professional sex work, not in disguise but within palace rooms repurposed for the encounters. Whether these exact events happened as described is uncertain. What matters is that they were widely reported and repeated in Rome and in outlying provinces. For critics, such stories became shorthand for saying he was unfit to rule. The combination of religious change and personal display became one problem in the eyes of Rome's traditional power brokers. The silk gowns and cosmetics drew attention, but elevating his Syrian sun god above Jupiter was a direct challenge to Rome's established religious hierarchy. For conservative senators, generals and priests, it seemed the emperor was replacing the core symbols of Roman identity with a foreign cult, one in which he himself was central. When you paired that with his public shifts in dress and role, it looked like a deliberate inversion of the expected order, political, religious and social all at once. Reactions outside the palace were a mixture of curiosity and disgust. To ordinary Romans, the details came as gossip, changing slightly with every retelling. To soldiers, hearing that their commander preferred the robes of a shrine dance or that he placed his god's altar higher than Jupiter's signaled instability and breach of tradition. Even those without strong feelings about his private life could view religious innovation as bad luck for Rome. Markets, baths and barracks traded the stories, weaving them into the city's sense of the emperor. Inside the palace, these choices narrowed his support. The Praetorian Guard's job was to protect the emperor, but their real loyalty was to stability and to themselves. They could endure eccentricities if the state was secure and the army respected the ruler. Here, the more he challenged Rome's most visible traditions, the more he seemed a risk, alienating the religious establishment, unsettling the Senate, and appearing in roles meant to shock left him exposed if the Guard ever decided a change was needed. It didn't help that political appointments under his rule often favoured those personally close to him, including lovers and favourites who lacked traditional qualifications. To opponents, this looked like governing for personal gratification, not the state's welfare. Combined with his ceremonial changes, it created a portrait of a ruler whose self-presentation and policy were aimed less at preserving Rome's institutions than at reshaping them around his own image. By 222 CE, tension had replaced fascination among the elites and the military. The Praetorian Guard, who had made and broken emperors before, moved against him. He was a teenager at the time, accompanied closely by his mother, who was also killed. His body was publicly displayed afterwards, a stark physical rejection of the man and the image he had projected. The visual spectacle of his rule, which had been impossible to ignore in life, was equally impossible to miss in death. For a state built on symbols, the lesson was plain. Challenging the deepest assumptions about who could rule, how they should appear, and which gods outranked which was safe only while those with the power to remove you felt secure. Elagabalus's clothing, rituals, lovers, and the reports of his private conduct were never just salacious details, they were political signals. In a culture where appearance and ceremony were part of the machinery of government, changing them meant changing the framework through which power was recognized. Once the army and the guard concluded that his experiments weakened that framework instead of strengthening it, his reign's end became inevitable. Even without certainty about every act attributed to him, the stories stuck because they fit the broader pattern his contemporaries recognized: a ruler whose personal presentation and religious policy aggressively defied the norms that bound emperor, senate, and soldiers together. That defiance is why his name endures, not only for the dresses or the painted eyes, but for embodying the risk of making personal identity a central feature of imperial policy. His reign stands as an example of how altering the symbols of authority can become a political act with lethal consequences. In the Rome of the 3rd century, tradition was more than habit. It was a stabilizing structure. Remove too many supports too quickly, and the whole thing could fall. It's a pattern you see in different eras. leaders treating the public stage as a place to remake identity, only to find that those meant to guard them see the performance as a threat. In Elagabalus's case, the distance between what he wanted to project and what his power base would accept became too wide to bridge. The result was abrupt, final, and brutal, and it mirrors a truth that's run through every court and palace in these stories. When those at the pinnacle of power push their private selves into a role the rest of the system refuses to accept, the fallout doesn't stop at image, it changes the calculation for every person and institution that stands beneath them. Sultan Ibrahim III of the Ottoman Empire, often called Ibrahim the Mad, reigned from 1640 to 1648, a period marked by instability, economic troubles, and increasing European pressure on Ottoman frontiers. His personal life, or more accurately, the accounts of his personal life, became notorious both in his own time and in later chronicles, cementing his reputation as one of the most eccentric and scandal-ridden rulers in Ottoman history. The most infamous story associated with him comes from 17th century sources, particularly those written by European envoys and Ottoman chroniclers who served under later sultans. These accounts describe an extraordinary episode in which Sultan Ibrahim, in a fit of both curiosity and desire, ordered a large number of young women, described as virgins in most versions of the tale, to be assembled within the palace harem. The number varies across reports. Some say a few dozen, others claim several hundred. All agree, however, that he wished them to be entirely unclothed and arranged in his presence. According to the chronicles, Ibrahim was fascinated by physical beauty to an almost obsessive degree. Court records note his insistence on selecting concubines with particular physical traits sometimes described in painstaking detail: hair of a certain length, complexion of a certain shade, and even body proportions measured before they could be admitted to his private quarters. This interest, while not unusual for a ruler with a harem, was reportedly pushed to extremes during his reign. The notorious gathering, often referred to in Ottoman gossip as a parade of the virgins, was said to be staged in one of the largest audience halls of Topkapi Palace, or possibly within the more secluded gardens of the imperial harem. The European ambassador to Constantinople at the time, Venetian envoy Alvisi Contarini, reported hearing that Ibrahim likened himself to a stallion at stud, boasting of his vigour and intending to prove it before selected witnesses from his inner circle. Ottoman sources, particularly the writings of chronicler Evliya Çelebi, are more cautious in tone. They frame the event as an example of Ibrahim's unpredictable moods and his susceptibility to suggestion by the women of the harem, especially his favoured consort Turan Hatish. Some suggest that the gathering may have been less about raw indulgence and more about displaying absolute control over the most intimate aspects of court life. In the symbolic world of palace politics, commanding the harem was not merely a personal matter, it was a statement of dominance over the dynasty's reproductive future. It's worth noting that the harem was not a place of constant debauchery, as European imagination often painted it. It was an intricate political institution, housing wives, concubines, mothers of princes and their attendants, many of whom wielded significant influence. For the Sultan to summon a large group of women and order them to present themselves in such a way was a breach of the usual protocol, shocking even by Ottoman standards. The episode's sexual overtones were, of course, amplified in later retellings, particularly by Western writers eager to portray the Ottoman court as decadent and morally decayed. In the 19th century, European Orientalist literature made much of Ibrahim's supposed excesses, turning him into a symbol of Eastern despotism, often without critically examining the political motives behind such portrayals. From a historian's perspective, whether the event occurred exactly as described is open to question. The sources are not all contemporary, and some were penned decades later under regimes that had an interest in discrediting Ibrahim's memory. His deposition in 1648 by the Janissaries, a powerful military corps, and subsequent execution were justified in part by claims of madness and moral corruption. Episodes like the Parade of the Virgins provided convenient proof for such charges. Yet even if the details were exaggerated, the persistence of this story tells us something important about the political culture of the time. Personal conduct could be weaponized as political evidence. Ottoman sultans were expected to embody not only military strength but also a moral authority that reflected Islamic ideals of rulership. A ruler seen as wasteful, indulgent, or sexually excessive could lose the respect of both the religious establishment and the military elite. In the context of Ibrahim's reign, this alleged incident was more than gossip. It became part of the narrative that justified his removal from the throne. His perceived instability, whether rooted in mental illness, isolation, or political manipulation, was woven into stories of outrageous behavior. The image of the Sultan surrounded by naked women served as a powerful metaphor for loss of restraint, overindulgence, and a detachment from the urgent needs of the empire. Furthermore, this account illustrates the tension between public duty and private power. The Sultan's authority was theoretically absolute, but in practice it was hemmed in by religious scholars, the ulema, military factions, and court officials. When a ruler's private life became a public liability, those factions could unite against him. The parade may have been remembered less for its alleged sensuality and more for what it represented, a ruler whose priorities had strayed far from governance. From a modern viewpoint, it is tempting to dismiss such tales as pure scandal, but within the 17th century Ottoman court, they functioned as political currency. Stories of indulgence circulated among officials, were whispered in the corridors of the palace, and found their way to foreign embassies. Whether strictly factual or embellished, they shaped the international image of the Sultanate and influenced the decisions of those who held real power behind the scenes. In the end, Sultan Ibrahim's reign lasted only 8 years. His downfall was swift and brutal, deposed by his own ministers, confined in the palace, and eventually strangled by the order of the new regime. The legends of his behaviour, including the infamous Virgin Gathering, lived on, less as accurate history than as cautionary allegory about the dangers of unchecked personal indulgence at the pinnacle of political authority. This is the enduring significance of the episode. It's not just about whether the Sultan behaved as a stallion, but about how a ruler's private image, once it slipped into the realm of rumour, could become the decisive factor in his political survival. In the fragile balance of Ottoman power, perception was as lethal as any blade. In many pre-modern courts, the private and the political were never truly separate. The ruler's personal relationships, especially those involving sexuality, could serve as a powerful instrument of governance. This was not about pleasure alone, it was about control, intimidation, and projection of authority. Across empires, from the Ottomans to the Mughals, from medieval European kingdoms to the dynasties of China, the ruler's sexual dominance was deeply tied to their public image. In these cultures, mastery over the private sphere symbolized mastery over the realm itself. In the Ottoman context, the harem was not only a private retreat, but a symbolic center of dynastic continuity. To control the harem, its women, its children, and its rituals, was to control the imperial bloodline. A sultan's ability to command obedience from hundreds within those walls reflected his ability to command obedience from millions outside them. Sexual domination here was rarely public in a literal sense. Instead, it was ritualized and carefully leaked through court gossip or foreign ambassadors' reports. When a ruler favored one consort over others, or when he dramatically replaced or dismissed a group of women, it sent a coded message to the court factions aligned with them. Entire political alliances could rise or fall depending on which woman gained the ruler's attention. In medieval and early modern Europe, sexual access to the king was not just a privilege, it could be a political appointment. Royal mistresses like Barbara Villiers under Charles II of England or Diane de Poitiers under Henry II of France wielded real influence, sometimes acting as brokers for petitions, distributing patronage, and shaping foreign alliances. Courtiers understood that to insult or oppose a favoured mistress was to risk exclusion from royal favour. These relationships also worked in reverse. The king's dominance over a celebrated mistress was a public performance of virility and authority. Chroniclers and poets often described the king's romantic triumphs alongside his military victories, blending the imagery of conquest in bed with conquest on the battlefield. In certain courts, rulers used sexual dominance to humiliate rivals. One infamous tactic, recorded in both Middle Eastern and South Asian sources, was the deliberate taking of a defeated enemy's wife or concubines into the victor's harem. This was not necessarily about personal desire. It was about demonstrating that the defeated ruler's lineage and honor had been conquered. In warrior cultures where family honor and bloodline were paramount, such acts were a devastating psychological blow. They symbolized total defeat. Not only had the enemy lost land and army, but his household, the most intimate and guarded part of his realm, now belonged to his conqueror. It is important to note that rulers rarely operated entirely in private. Their courts functioned like audiences, even in intimate matters. Palace servants, guards, eunuchs, ladies-in-waiting, and ministers formed an ever-present circle of witnesses. Rumors were inevitable, and rulers often cultivated them deliberately. A king who was known to have many lovers, or who kept an unusually large harem, was projecting a narrative of abundance and potency. In societies that equated virility with strength, this image could bolster a ruler's authority just as much as military success. Conversely, a ruler perceived as sexually weak or uninterested could face whispers about his suitability to lead. In Islamic empires, Christian monarchies and Hindu kingdoms alike, rulers often walked a fine line between religious expectations and personal conduct. While moral codes outwardly promoted chastity or marital fidelity, rulers could justify their private dominance through divine right ideology, the belief that their exceptional status exempted them from ordinary rules. For example, Ottoman sultans as caliphs were supposed to embody Islamic virtue, yet their harems were immense and politically charged. Medieval European kings crowned by the grace of God often took mistresses openly, interpreting their own will as aligned with divine will. This duality allowed sexual domination to be reframed as a privilege of sovereignty. It was not vice. It was a demonstration of God-given supremacy. In some cases, rulers used sexual acts as direct punishment. Historical records from Mongol and certain Middle Eastern courts describe scenarios in which captured rebels or traitors were forced to witness the ruler taking their wives or concubines, an act designed to strip them of dignity and assert irreversible dominance. These acts, while brutal, were understood in their time as a language of power. In the absence of democratic institutions, the ruler's personal supremacy had to be constantly reaffirmed, and sexual control was one of its starkest expressions. A striking feature of these dynamics is that the ruler rarely faced public challenge over such behavior. Those who served close to power, ministers, generals, religious officials, had strong incentives to remain silent. A ruler's sexual dominance over others reinforced his symbolic dominance over them as well. To speak out against the former was to question the latter, which could be fatal. This silence allowed the ruler's reputation to grow unchecked. Even exaggerated tales worked in his favour, cementing an image of a leader beyond ordinary limits. Sexual dominance thus became part of the mythology of rule. Yet this weapon was double-edged. While sexual domination could intimidate and unify a court in the short term, it could also sow deep resentment. Those excluded from influence or whose allies were humiliated could become lifelong enemies. In some historical cases, such resentment built into conspiracies that ended in deposition or assassination. This tension would appear again and again in imperial history. The same private acts that reinforced authority in the moment often weakened it in the long run. In the complex interplay of politics and intimacy, sexual domination functioned as both a tool of control and a performance of sovereignty. It projected power to allies and enemies alike, communicated messages without words, and reinforced the idea that the ruler's reach extended into every aspect of life, even the most private. In a world without mass media, the body of the ruler itself was the message. How he lived, whom he favored, and how he displayed his dominance became as important as laws or military campaigns. For many monarchs, controlling desire, or more often displaying its control over others, was not a distraction from politics. It was politics. In examining the persistence of extreme or morally questionable behavior among medieval and early modern rulers, it becomes clear that court tolerance was rarely based on genuine approval. Instead, it was the product of entrenched political structures, cultural norms, economic dependency, and a well-founded fear of reprisal. Understanding these dynamics helps explain why certain behaviors could continue unchecked for years, sometimes decades, before they provoked any serious challenge. The most fundamental reason for tolerance was the structure of monarchy itself. In most pre-modern systems, the ruler was not merely the head of state but also the source of law. His word had the force of legislation, and his will could override established customs. There was generally no independent judiciary capable of holding the ruler accountable, and parliaments or assemblies, where they existed, were often advisory rather than limiting. This meant that acts which would have been considered crimes for ordinary subjects could be reframed as lawful when performed by the sovereign. The concept of illegal behavior by a monarch was therefore ambiguous, often left to interpretation by religious authorities or by political factions with enough strength to enforce their view. Royal courts were sustained through a system of patronage. Courtiers, ministers, and even high-ranking nobles were economically dependent on the ruler's favour. Access to land grants, pensions, ceremonial offices, and commercial privileges all flowed from the sovereign. Losing that favour could mean not only the end of a political career, but also the loss of wealth, property, and influence. This financial dependency created a strong incentive to overlook personal misconduct. Even those who disapproved of the ruler's actions understood that open criticism could quickly lead to their economic ruin. In many medieval and early modern states, the ruler possessed near total power to punish dissent. Opposition could be construed as treason, and the consequences could be severe: imprisonment, exile, confiscation of property, or execution. The historical record provides many examples of ministers, generals, and even members of the royal family who paid with their lives for challenging the sovereign. Given these risks, silence was the safer choice. Courtiers learned to navigate the ruler's personal excesses with caution, often avoiding any expression that could be interpreted as disapproval. A further layer of protection came from ideologies of divine right. In Christian Europe, kings were believed to rule by the grace of God. In Islamic empires, sultans could claim the role of caliph or protector of the faith. In many South Asian and East Asian contexts, rulers were considered semi-divine or chosen by heavenly mandate. Such beliefs could discourage moral confrontation. Criticizing the ruler's conduct risked being perceived as challenging divine will itself. Religious authorities sometimes attempted quiet persuasion, but open opposition was rare unless the ruler's actions were seen as endangering the faith or the stability of the realm. The ceremonial life of the court reinforced hierarchical distance between ruler and subject. Strict protocols governed who could approach the monarch, speak to him, or even look directly at him. In some courts, verbal interaction without explicit permission was prohibited. This constant reinforcement of deference had a psychological effect. It discouraged courtiers from imagining themselves as having the right to question the sovereign's personal life. The ruler's decisions, public or private, were treated as matters beyond the reach of ordinary judgment. Courts were rarely unified entities. They were composed of factions, each pursuing its own interests. A ruler's private behavior might be tolerated by one faction because it aligned with their goals, while another faction might disapprove but lack the strength to act. This competitive environment often resulted in strategic silence. Disapproval was set aside in favor of maintaining political advantage. If a ruler's behavior weakened a rival faction or enhanced one's own position, tolerance became a pragmatic choice. In societies without mass media, rulers had considerable control over information. The most damaging episodes in a monarch's private life could be contained within palace walls, known only to a small circle of attendants, guards, and confidants. Rumours might circulate, but without independent verification, they could be dismissed as slander. Official court historians, dependent on royal patronage, often presented sanitized versions of events, ensuring that the ruler's public image remained largely intact. This information control meant that even widely known misconduct could be shielded from formal scrutiny. In some circumstances, the court may have judged that tolerating the ruler's excesses was preferable to destabilizing the realm. Removing a sovereign could trigger a succession crisis or even civil war. If the ruler's misconduct was viewed as manageable, contained within the palace and not threatening military or financial stability, factions might prefer to endure it rather than risk broader instability. This calculation was especially common when the ruler had no clear or competent heir. In such cases, even a flawed monarch could be seen as a safer option than uncertainty. Tolerance was not infinite. When a ruler's private conduct began to erode military effectiveness, drain the treasury, or alienate too many key power blocks, factions could turn on him. In such moments, long-ignored scandals were brought forward as political weapons to justify removal. This pattern can be seen in cases like Sultan Ibrahim I of the Ottoman Empire, where years of rumour about personal excesses were suddenly framed as evidence of unfitness for the throne once his political position weakened. What had been tolerated became grounds for deposition when the balance of power shifted. The tolerance of questionable private behaviour in medieval courts was rooted in the realities of absolute power, economic dependence, fear of reprisal, religious legitimacy, strict court etiquette, political factionalism, and information control. It was rarely an endorsement of the behaviour itself, rather it was a calculated survival strategy. In such an environment, challenging the ruler's personal conduct was often more dangerous than enduring it. Silence was not complicity in the moral sense, it was a recognition that the cost of speaking outweighed the possibility of change. If the ruler's actions did not directly threaten the core stability of the realm, they were likely to remain unchallenged. The exercise of absolute power over a state, particularly in pre-modern societies where no institutional limits existed, created unique psychological conditions for rulers. These conditions often intensified over time, shaping personal behaviour in ways that could appear extreme, erratic, or self-indulgent. Understanding these pressures is crucial to explaining why certain monarchs, emperors, or sultans engaged in conduct that contemporaries and later historians would consider excessive. Absolute rulers lived in an environment that systematically separated them from ordinary human interaction. Court protocol restricted access, and the ruler's movements were controlled for security and ceremonial purposes. Over years, this produced a profound social isolation. Unlike commoners, monarchs rarely encountered unfiltered opinions or criticism. Conversations were often shaped by flattery, fear, or political calculation. Without routine exposure to dissent or contradiction, rulers could lose a sense of proportion in their actions. Behaviours that might shock or offend the wider population could seem normal within the insulated environment of the palace. The court culture of most medieval and early modern states rewarded those who pleased the ruler. This produced a constant stream of flattery and affirmation which could distort the sovereign's self-image. Over time, some rulers came to believe in their own infallibility or exceptional status, not only in political matters but in all areas of life, including personal relationships and morality. When this inflated self-perception met complete control over resources, people, and law, it could manifest in behaviours aimed at testing or displaying personal power, including in the private sphere. Although monarchs were isolated from ordinary criticism, They were also under continuous observation by courtiers, diplomats, and foreign envoys. Every action, rumour, and relationship could be interpreted politically. This awareness created its own psychological strain. For some rulers, this led to carefully staged performances of strength, virility, or dominance, meant to reinforce their image both domestically and abroad. In certain cases, the display of sexual power was part of this performance, functioning as a symbolic counterpart to military or political control. Absolute rulers were frequently the targets of plots, coups, and assassinations. Historical records are full of palace conspiracies, military uprisings, and factional struggles. This environment could foster chronic paranoia, leading rulers to view even close associates with suspicion. In extreme cases, paranoia extended to the ruler's private life. The control of the harem, the selection of concubines, and the regulation of court intimacy could all become arenas for reinforcing loyalty and eliminating perceived threats. What might appear as personal excess could also be a defensive measure, intended, consciously or not, to keep potential rivals under constant observation. Many medieval rulers inherited the throne at a young age. Raised from birth to expect absolute authority, they often received an education focused on political survival and ceremonial display rather than personal discipline. Without formative experiences that placed limits on their behavior, such rulers could develop a sense that restraint was unnecessary. Over decades, this lack of internal boundaries could manifest in increasingly unconventional or extreme expressions of personal will. In cultures where a ruler's legitimacy was tied to perceived vitality, physical strength, and masculine dominance, there was pressure to demonstrate these traits in both public and private life. Military victories, hunting prowess, and the possession of a large harem or numerous lovers could all serve as symbolic indicators of capability. This expectation created a feedback loop. The more a ruler's image depended on personal dominance, the more extreme the displays might become. In some cases, private behavior that we would now classify as indulgent or excessive was, at the time, a calculated effort to meet political expectations. The burdens of governance, especially in vast empires, could be relentless. War, diplomacy, internal unrest, and succession disputes placed enormous demands on a ruler's attention. For some, indulgence in elaborate entertainments or unusual personal practices functioned as escapism. The problem was that in an environment where all desires could be met instantly, novelty became harder to find. This pursuit of ever more distinctive experiences could lead rulers into behaviors that contemporaries saw as extreme, even if the initial impulse was simply the search for relief from political stress. In many political systems, the ruler's body was a metaphor for the state itself. A healthy, vigorous ruler was believed to ensure a healthy, vigorous realm. Sexual vitality, therefore, could be read as a sign of political vitality. This symbolic connection sometimes encouraged monarchs to engage in and publicize acts that emphasized potency and dominance. What may look like purely personal excess can thus be seen, in context, as a form of political signaling aimed at reassuring subjects and intimidating rivals. Modern historians and psychologists have speculated about the role of mental illness in the behavior of certain rulers. Chronic stress, isolation, trauma from warfare, and hereditary conditions could all contribute to mental instability. Without modern medical understanding or treatment, such conditions often went unmanaged, sometimes manifesting in erratic decision-making and personal conduct outside accepted norms. However, caution is necessary in applying modern diagnoses to historical figures. Behaviors that appear symptomatic to us may have been shaped as much by the unique pressures of absolute power as by any underlying condition. In a normal social environment, extreme behavior is moderated by feedback from peers, family, or community. Absolute rulers, by contrast, often lived without effective corrective mechanisms. Advisors who might otherwise intervene risked their positions or lives by doing so. Over time, this absence of challenge could allow behaviors to escalate unchecked. When the only limits were those the ruler imposed on himself, and when those limits eroded under the pressures described above, personal extremes became more likely. The psychological pressures of absolute power combined isolation, constant flattery, public scrutiny, paranoia, inherited entitlement, the need to project strength, escapism, symbolic politics, possible mental health issues, and the absence of corrective feedback. Together, these factors created an environment in which rulers could gradually lose the constraints that govern ordinary human behavior. In this context, what might seem like inexplicable extremes were often the predictable outcomes of a political system that concentrated authority without accountability. The same conditions that enabled effective centralized rule could, over time, produce personal conduct that undermined both the ruler's dignity and the stability of the state. In many historical cases, the personal behavior of rulers had direct political consequences. While individual acts of excess did not, on their own, bring down empires, persistent patterns of private misconduct could weaken legitimacy, alienate powerful groups, and accelerate structural decline. Understanding this connection requires examining the mechanisms by which a ruler's personal life intersected with state stability. In pre-modern political systems, legitimacy rested not only on military strength and dynastic succession, but also on moral authority. Rulers were expected to embody the values of their society, whether framed in religious, cultural, or ethical terms. Excessive or morally questionable personal behavior risked eroding that perception. When scandal became widely known through court gossip, diplomatic reports, or public rumor, it could damage the symbolic role of the monarch as the guardian of justice and order. Once undermined, this form of legitimacy was difficult to restore, particularly in societies where the ruler was seen as the living representative of divine will or cultural tradition. The functioning of most empires depended on the cooperation of key political elites, military commanders, high-ranking nobles, senior administrators, and religious authorities. Private behavior that was perceived as reckless, wasteful, or dishonorable could alienate these groups. Alienation often began gradually. Officials might reduce their engagement, delay implementing orders, or seek to distance themselves from the sovereign's inner circle. Over time, these small acts of disengagement could develop into coordinated opposition, with personal misconduct serving as a rallying point for discontented factions. When rulers prioritized personal indulgence over state affairs, administrative efficiency suffered. Important decisions might be delayed or delegated to favorites who lacked competence, resulting in policy failures. The absence of direct oversight could allow corruption to flourish within the bureaucracy, further weakening the state's capacity to govern effectively. In competitive geopolitical environments, this neglect could be exploited by rival states, leading to territorial losses, weakened alliances, or economic disadvantage. Sustaining a lifestyle of extreme indulgence placed financial burdens on the state. Maintaining large harems, funding elaborate entertainments, and granting costly favors to courtiers and favorites could consume significant resources. In economies dependent on steady revenue from taxation, trade, or tribute, such diversions of funds could have measurable effects on public works, military readiness, and disaster relief. When combined with existing fiscal pressures, such as war, famine, or trade disruption, personal extravagance could tip the balance toward financial crisis. Once a ruler's personal life became politically damaging, it could be used as a tool by opponents. Factions at court might publicize incidents to undermine the ruler's authority, sometimes exaggerating or distorting events to increase their impact. Religious authorities could frame the behavior as a moral failing, mobilizing popular opinion. Foreign powers also exploited such scandals. Diplomats could circulate unflattering accounts to weaken the ruler's negotiating position or justify hostile action under the guise of confronting moral corruption. In many empires, the loyalty of the military, particularly elite guard units, was crucial to maintaining power. A ruler whose behavior created perceptions of weakness or decadence risked losing that loyalty. Military leaders might question whether such a ruler could lead effectively in times of crisis, and if confidence eroded far enough, the armed forces themselves could become agents of deposition. The Ottoman Empire offers several examples in which the Janissaries removed sultans whose private conduct was seen as incompatible with effective leadership. In official histories, especially those written after a regime change, the personal misconduct of rulers was often emphasized as part of a larger narrative of decline. Chroniclers linked moral decay at the top with the weakening of the state, framing the sovereign's excesses as both a symptom and a cause of collapse. This narrative functioned as a warning to future rulers and as a form of political justification for the new regime. It reinforced the idea that private morality was inseparable from public stability. A single incident of misconduct rarely caused immediate collapse. The real danger lay in the cumulative effect of repeated episodes, which reinforced perceptions of incompetence, moral decay, and detachment from governance. Over time, each new scandal confirmed and deepened existing doubts, making it easier for opponents to build a case for removal. By the time open opposition formed, the damage to legitimacy and authority was often irreversible. Initially, courts often tolerated or ignored a ruler's private excesses, as removing a monarch was disruptive and potentially dangerous. However, when personal behavior began to intersect with political or military failures, tolerance diminished. What had been dismissed as private eccentricity could suddenly be reframed as evidence of unfitness to rule. At this stage, scandals became politically useful. They offered a clear and easily understood rationale for deposition, rallying both elite and popular support for change. The private conduct of rulers mattered because it influenced perceptions of legitimacy, shaped elite alliances, and affected the practical functioning of the state. While personal excesses did not by themselves destroy empires, they could weaken the foundations on which political stability rested. When combined with external pressures, economic strain, and military setbacks, such behavior often served as a catalyst for change, and, in extreme cases, for the end of a dynasty. In systems where the ruler's image was inseparable from the state's identity, the collapse of personal credibility could quickly become the collapse of political authority itself. The most provocative aspect of many rulers' lives, their sexual behavior, was often intended to remain within the closed world of the palace or harem. Yet across empires and centuries, details of these private indulgences routinely surfaced, shaping court politics, influencing public perception, and even playing a role in the ruler's downfall. The process by which intimate conduct moved from secrecy to scandal reveals how fragile the boundaries between private life and political life truly were. Royal courts operated like self-contained cities with hundreds or even thousands of attendants, guards, entertainers, and servants. Even the most closely guarded harems depended on cooks, tailors, musicians, physicians, and eunuchs. Each of these roles provided opportunities to observe, overhear, or deduce details about the ruler's intimate habits. While loyalty was often assumed, it could never be fully guaranteed. Servants might pass information to ambitious courtiers who could then relay it to political allies. In some cases, details were exaggerated to make them more politically potent. Factional politics were a constant in pre-modern courts. A rival of the ruler's current favourite, whether a concubine, queen, or male companion, might encourage the spread of stories about favouritism, unusual sexual preferences, or excessive indulgence. The aim was rarely moral outrage for its own sake. Rather, it was to weaken the influence of the rival and shift the ruler's attention elsewhere. The sexual dimension made such rumours particularly effective. In many cultures, a ruler's self-control in private life was seen as a measure of his ability to control the state. a portrait of the sovereign as ruled by desire could be a devastating political weapon. Foreign envoys often acted as discreet observers of court life. Venetian, French and English ambassadors in Ottoman Constantinople, Mughal Delhi and the courts of European monarchs regularly reported on the ruler's personal relationships. These accounts, sent in coded or carefully worded dispatches, were valued by their governments as indicators of political stability or weakness. If an envoy concluded that a ruler's sexual excesses distracted him from governance, delayed military campaigns, or created resentment among elites, this intelligence could influence foreign strategy, from trade negotiations to military planning. In societies where religious institutions played a central political role, clerics or legal scholars were sometimes privy to confidential information about the ruler's conduct. While they often preferred private admonition, they could also become conduits for public condemnation when political circumstances shifted. In moments of crisis, moral accusations carried the weight of divine judgment, turning private vice into public sin. Even without explicit eyewitness accounts, a ruler's indulgences could be inferred from public display. The sudden elevation of a previously unknown concubine, lavish gifts of land or treasure to favoured companions, or the unexplained dismissal of long-standing consorts were all read as signs of shifting personal loyalties. In capitals and major cities, such changes became fertile ground for gossip, often embroidered with speculation about the ruler's sexual tastes or excesses. Large cities surrounding royal courts acted as echo chambers. Merchants, entertainers, and lower-ranking officials interacted daily with those connected to palace service. Information, or rumour, moved quickly through markets, taverns, and salons. In literate societies, satirical verses and plays could disguise critiques of the ruler's private life in allegory, making them harder to censor but easy for audiences to decode. These urban gossip networks ensured that once a scandal began, it could not be contained within the palace walls. Rumour became politically significant when it aligned with the needs of a discontented faction or an external threat. Domestic rivals could present tales of indulgence as evidence of neglecting governance. Religious leaders could frame private acts as moral failings that endangered the state's divine favour. Military elites could cite decadence as justification for replacing the ruler with a more disciplined leader. In each case, the sexual nature of the accusation intensified its impact, appealing to both moral and political concerns. The most damaging scandals were those that changed how key stakeholders perceived the ruler. A monarch once seen as disciplined and formidable might, after repeated accounts of indulgence, be viewed as weakened or distracted. This shift in perception could alter alliances, embolden rivals, and encourage foreign adversaries to act. Once a ruler was deposed or a dynasty replaced, official historians often recorded the alleged sexual excesses as part of the explanation for decline. These accounts, sometimes written decades later, fixed the scandal in the historical record, ensuring that the ruler's reputation was permanently associated with moral corruption. Sexual indulgence, when kept within palace walls, was often tolerated or ignored. But once details escaped into factional politics, religious discourse, urban gossip, and diplomatic reports, it could become a potent tool of political transformation. In societies where the ruler's moral authority was inseparable from the legitimacy of the state, the public exposure of private vice could weaken the foundations of rule more effectively than military defeat. The journey from private conduct to public scandal illustrates the permeability of royal secrecy and the political value of intimate knowledge, a value that, in many cases, shaped the fate of empires. When rulers acted as if no judgment applied to them, their private choices became political acts. Reputation shaped whether they could hold power. Intimate acts could be turned into tools of control, and the institutions around them often let cruelty stand if it meant the dynasty stayed intact. So yes, question the tidy portraits and the smooth timelines. These were flawed people whose personal decisions could bend the course of whole nations. If you enjoy quiet history told this way, you can like or subscribe and maybe share in the comments which life you'd like to unpack quietly next. In the end, these stories remind us that power tests the limits of human frailty as much as it does the strength of any empire.